Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling some pretty complex stuff. The world of economic thought,
Oh, yeah.
specifically the ideas of Friedrich A. Hayek.
Hayek.
Now, Hayek was a prominent 20th century economist and philosopher. You sent over some excerpts from his work, Individualism and Economic Order, and I'm really excited to see what we can uncover.
Well, Hayek's work is really fascinating because he kind of pushes us to think differently about how societies work. He was really skeptical of this idea that we could just design a perfect society from the top down.
Yeah.
Instead, he argued that the most successful societies actually develop organically through a process he called spontaneous order.
Spontaneous order. So how does this spontaneous order actually play out in the real world? Does it mean no rules, no structure at all, just pure chaos?
No, not exactly.
Okay.
Hayek actually believed in having a framework of general rules,
Yeah.
Things like property rights and contract law,
Right.
that allow individuals to make their own choices and interact freely. And then from those interactions, a complex and efficient order emerges, almost like a self-organizing system.
So it's less about having a super detailed blueprint and more about setting the stage for individuals to kind of create order through their action.
Exactly. And this really ties into his distinction between what he called true and false individualism.
Ah.
True individualism for Hayek thrives within this system of spontaneous order, where individuals are free to make choices within that framework of agreed upon rules.
So then what about false individualism? Where did he see the pitfalls there?
Well, for Hayek, false individualism falls into the trap of believing that we can just perfectly engineer or plan a society.
Yeah.
And that often leads to a concentration of power in the hands of a few,
Right.
and ultimately to what he saw as collectivism, which
Interesting.
actually hinders true individual freedom and creativity.
This whole distinction between true and false individualism, it really resonates with me when I think about like current debates on social media, censorship.
Mhm.
Is it truly individualistic to silence certain voices, even if those voices are deemed harmful or dangerous by some? It feels like that kind of goes against the idea of letting individuals freely interact and debate within a set of established rules.
That's a great point and a very relevant application of Hayek's thinking to today's issues. He was a big proponent of letting individuals form their own opinions based on the free flow of information and ideas.
Yeah, for sure. And one of my favorite Hayek quotes is, "Nations stumble upon establishments which are indeed the result of human action, but not the result of human design."
Hmm.
That quote really highlights the concept of spontaneous order, right? Like, think about it. So many of the complex systems in society, whether it's language or even the economy itself, they've kind of evolved without a central planner dictating their development.
Absolutely. Hayek argued that this type of spontaneous order, guided by individual choices and general rules, is ultimately more adaptable and efficient than any system a central authority could create.
So now this leads us to another key concept in Hayek's work, the role of knowledge in society.
Yes.
I know he believed this was crucial to understanding how markets and societies function.
Uh-huh.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, Hayek was really adamant that knowledge in a society is widely dispersed.
Right.
Every individual possesses unique bits of information based on their experiences, skills, and interactions.
Okay.
And he argued that no central planner could ever really gather and process all the information that's needed to make truly effective decisions for an entire society.
So if central planning is not the answer, then what's the alternative? How do we harness this dispersed knowledge to make good economic decisions?
Well, Hayek's answer is the price system.
Okay.
He saw the price system in a free market as kind of a brilliant information processing mechanism.
Interesting.
Prices, in a way, become signals communicating information about scarcity, supply, and demand,
Yeah.
far more efficiently than any central planning committee ever could.
So could you give us an example just to make that a bit more tangible for our listeners?
Certainly. Think about how the price of gasoline goes up when there's a shortage. Consumers naturally start conserving. Maybe they drive less or they carpool more, and they do this without anyone having to tell them to.
Right.
The price itself is conveying that information about scarcity, and it motivates people to adjust their behavior accordingly.
It's almost like an invisible hand guiding the market towards an equilibrium.
That's a good analogy, and it connects back to Adam Smith's concept of the invisible hand, which Hayek drew a lot of inspiration from.
Right.
The market can process this incredible amount of information and coordinate all these individual actions in a way that would be impossible to replicate through centralized planning.
Now, speaking of the market, I know Hayek was also a huge advocate for competition.
Oh, yeah.
What role did he see competition playing in a free and prosperous society?
He viewed competition when it's combined with well-defined property rights and contract enforcement as a real driving force of progress.
Okay.
He saw it as a kind of continuous discovery procedure,
Right.
always pushing for greater efficiency and innovation.
So competition keeps everyone on their toes, incentivizes them to improve and adapt.
Precisely. And Hayek also had a somewhat unconventional view on what economists call perfect competition.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's this theoretical ideal often discussed in textbooks.
Yeah.
But Hayek argued that striving for perfect competition was actually a misguided goal.
Why is that? It seems counterintuitive.
He believed that real-world markets are never going to be perfect in that textbook sense.
Okay.
What matters most is that there are no artificial barriers to entry. That new businesses can challenge the existing ones, and that the threat of competition is always present.
Gotcha.
He felt that even imperfect competition was far superior to a lack of competition altogether, which often leads to stagnation and inefficiency.
He famously said, we should worry much less about whether competition in a given case is perfect and worry much more whether there's competition at all.
Yeah.
That really highlights his pragmatic approach to economics.
Exactly. He was less concerned with these theoretical ideals and more focused on the practical implications of policies and how they actually impacted individual freedom and economic growth.
Which leads us directly into Hayek's critique of socialist economic planning, which he saw as a system that inherently stifled competition and often led to unintended consequences.
Yes.
Now, that's a topic that I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with, at least on some level.
Uh-huh.
Why was Hayek so opposed to socialist planning? Wasn't it meant to create a fairer, more equitable society?
Well, while the goals of socialist planning may have been well-intentioned, Hayek saw some fundamental flaws in the system itself.
Right.
He believed that centralizing all of that knowledge in the hands of a few was a recipe for disaster.
So what was his core argument against central planning? Like, why did he think it wouldn't work in practice?
Well, he argued that central planners would face this insurmountable task. They would need to collect and process information on millions of goods and services, constantly adjust prices to reflect changing conditions, and somehow anticipate the needs and desires of millions of individuals.
Yeah, that's a pretty tall order to fill.
It is. It's mind-boggling to even imagine the complexity of that.
Absolutely. Did he offer any specific examples of why he thought the system would inevitably fail?
One of his key arguments was that central planners would really struggle to accurately set prices.
Okay.
He believed that prices in a free market serve a really crucial function, They convey vital information about the relative scarcity of goods and resources.
Right.
But without this price signaling mechanism, planners would essentially be operating in the dark,
Yeah.
unable to allocate resources efficiently.
So it's kind of like trying to navigate a complex maze while blindfolded?
Exactly. And Hayek had a rather witty observation about how this might even affect economists themselves.
Okay.
He suggested that under a fully planned economy, economists might be deprived of their occupation.
That's fascinating. Did he elaborate on that idea?
He argued that without a market mechanism which economists study to understand how value is determined, their expertise would become largely irrelevant. He believed that eliminating this system would create a level of economic chaos that would be beyond comprehension even for those with extensive economic knowledge.
So if central planning is so problematic, what was Hayek's view then on the role of government in the economy? Was he a proponent of complete laissez-faire? Or did he see a role for some government intervention?
That's a great question. And it leads us to another really fascinating aspect of Hayek's thinking.
Okay.
While he was incredibly skeptical of government intervention, particularly when it came to central planning, he wasn't advocating for the complete absence of government in economic matters.
So there's nuance to his position.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
While Hayek believed that individual freedom and spontaneous order were really the keys to a prosperous society, he recognized that government does have a vital role to play in establishing and enforcing a clear set of rules that allow markets to function effectively.
So it's more about creating a level playing field where individuals can operate freely without fear of arbitrary interference or confiscation of their property.
Precisely, Hayek also believed that government had a role to play in ensuring fair competition and preventing the formation of monopolies that could stifle innovation and harm consumers.
It sounds like he was advocating for a careful balancing act. Ensuring enough government intervention to provide that stable framework for the market, but not so much that it stifles individual initiative and distorts market signals.
Exactly. He actually dedicated a significant portion of his work to exploring how specific areas of law, like patent law, corporation law, and taxation, could be reformed to promote a freer and more competitive society.
I see. But I imagine he also had concerns about the dangers of certain types of government intervention as well, right?
Absolutely. Hayek was particularly wary of policies aimed at achieving full employment
Okay.
or maintaining specific capital values at any cost.
Hmm.
He believed that these policies often led to distortions in the market,
Right.
creating more problems than they solved.
So what was the basis of that concern? Why did he think those types of interventions were so harmful?
Well, he believed that attempts to manipulate the market to achieve specific outcomes often backfired because they interfered with the natural mechanisms of price discovery and resource allocation.
Gotcha.
He saw these interventions as attempts to control a complex system with incomplete information, which inevitably led to unintended consequences.
So he was essentially arguing against trying to micromanage the economy.
Precisely. He believed that governments should focus on creating a sound legal framework for the market and then allow individuals to make their own decisions based on the information conveyed through prices and competition.
This all makes sense, but it also sounds like his stance could be easily misconstrued or oversimplified.
That's true. Hayek's views on government intervention were nuanced and often misunderstood.
Yeah.
He wasn't advocating for complete anarchy or a total absence of government.
Right.
He simply believed that government intervention should be limited and carefully considered, always taking into account those potential unintended consequences.
This has been a really insightful dive so far into Hayek's views on individualism, spontaneous order, and the role of government. But I know he also had fascinating ideas about international federalism and the future of freedom.
Yes, that's another area where Hayek's thinking was truly ahead of its time.
Absolutely.
He saw the potential for greater peace and prosperity through a system of international cooperation that kind of went beyond the traditional nation-state model.
I'm really curious to hear more about that, but it looks like we're just about out of time for this segment.
Okay.
Luckily for us, though, this is a deep dive, so we've got plenty more time to explore those ideas in our next segment.
Indeed, I think our listeners will find Hayek's vision for international cooperation particularly intriguing, especially in the context of today's increasingly interconnected world.
Yeah, I think so too.
All right.
Well, we'll pick up right where we left off next time. So until then, keep those brain cells firing.
Always.
And we'll see you back here for part 2 of our deep dive into the brilliant mind of Friedrich A. Hayek.
Sounds
All right, so let's jump back into our exploration of Hayek's ideas. Before the break, we were about to delve into his vision for international federalism. It sounds pretty complex. What exactly did he propose?
Well, Hayek's concept of international federalism was indeed ambitious. He believed that the best path to lasting peace and individual freedom on a global scale lay in a system of what he called interstate federalism that went beyond the traditional model of nation-states.
So when he talked about federalism, he wasn't simply referencing systems like we see in the United States or other existing federations.
Exactly. He was thinking on a much grander scale. He envisioned a world where individual nations would willingly cede some of their sovereign power to a supranational federation.
Okay.
And this federation would then be responsible for matters that transcended national borders, things like maintaining international peace, upholding a common legal framework that applied to all member states, and ensuring the free movement of goods, capital, and people across borders.
It almost sounds like a global version of the U.S. federal system, but with a lighter touch, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Hayek was very clear that this international federation should have limited and clearly defined powers, primarily focused on preventing conflict and fostering cooperation among nations.
Right.
He didn't envision a world government that would dictate policies to individual countries.
This raises a really important question, though. Why did Hayek think that this type of international federalism was so crucial? What were the driving forces behind his idea?
He had several compelling reasons. One of his primary concerns was the inherent conflict he saw arising from economic borders between nations. He believed that dismantling these barriers and establishing a common economic space where goods and services could flow freely would significantly reduce the likelihood of international conflict.
That makes sense. If countries are economically intertwined and dependent on each other, they have a strong incentive to avoid war and maintain peaceful relations.
Precisely. It's much harder to justify going to war with a nation that's also your biggest trading partner.
Okay.
Hayek saw economic interdependence as a really powerful force for peace. But he also believed that a federal structure could play a crucial role in limiting the power of individual national governments.
That's interesting. So by creating a higher level of government, a federation, you actually end up with less government intrusion in people's lives. How does that work?
It's about checks and balances.
Hmm.
Think of it this way. In a federal system, power is divided between a central government and the individual states or provinces.
Right.
This division creates a system of checks and balances that prevents any one level of government from becoming too powerful or overreaching.
I see.
Hayek believed that this same principle could be applied on a global scale, helping to safeguard individual liberty from the potential encroachment of overzealous national governments.
So it's about creating a system where power is distributed rather than concentrated.
Exactly. Hayek was deeply suspicious of concentrated power, whether it was in the hands of a single national government or a global governing body. He believed that distributing power across multiple levels or institutions was the best way to protect individual freedom and prevent tyranny.
It's fascinating how all of Hayek's ideas about limited government, spontaneous order, and individual freedom all seem to fit together so seamlessly. He created a really coherent and interconnected framework for thinking about how societies should function.
His work is remarkably cohesive. It offers a powerful lens for understanding the delicate interplay between individual liberty, economic order, and the appropriate role of government in society, both domestically and internationally.
Hayek was obviously a deep and influential thinker, but his ideas are sometimes criticized for being too theoretical or idealistic, out of touch with the practical realities of the world. What would you say to those who kind of dismiss his work on those grounds?
I'd argue that those criticisms often miss the mark. While Hayek was undoubtedly a visionary, he was also a realist. He understood that profound change doesn't happen overnight. He wasn't naive enough to think that his ideas about limited government or international federalism could be implemented immediately.
Right.
But he firmly believed that by articulating these ideas clearly and persuasively, he could plant the seeds for a freer and more prosperous future, even if that future was generations away.
That's a really important point. He was playing the long game, focusing on the power of ideas to shape the future.
Exactly.
It reminds us that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, ideas matter. They have the potential to shift perspectives, inspire action, and ultimately change the world.
Absolutely. Hayek believed that ideas are incredibly powerful forces capable of shaping not only individual lives, but also the course of history. He saw his role as a scholar and thinker to challenge conventional wisdom, to offer alternative perspectives, and to spark debate about the fundamental questions of how we organize societies and live together.
Now, we've been deep diving into some pretty complex and theoretical concepts.
Yeah.
So let's try to connect these ideas back to our listeners' everyday life. What does all of this mean for us as individuals navigating the complexities of the 21st century? How can we apply Hayek's thinking to the challenges we face today?
That's a great question. I think Hayek would encourage us to engage in thoughtful, open-minded debate about the issues that matter most to us. He'd want us to be wary of simplistic solutions or grand promises that sound appealing but often lead to unintended consequences. He'd urge us to be champions of individual liberty, to recognize the limits of government, and to always be skeptical of those who claim to have all the answers or who seek to concentrate power in their own hands.
He'd probably also advise us to be cautious of those grand schemes that promise utopia but often deliver something far less desirable.
Precisely. He was a strong believer in the power of decentralized decision-making and allowing individuals to make choices based on their own knowledge and preferences rather than having those choices dictated by a central authority.
This brings us back to his concept of spontaneous order, the idea that the best solutions often emerge not from top-down planning, but from the countless interactions of free individuals pursuing their own goals within a framework of clearly defined rules.
Exactly. Hayek believed that the collective wisdom and ingenuity of individuals, when allowed to flourish within a system that respects individual liberty and limits the power of government, could achieve far more than any centralized planning effort ever could.
This has been a truly mind-expanding deep dive into Hayek's ideas.
Yeah.
His thoughts on individualism, free markets, and the role of government are both challenging and inspiring, and they offer a lot to think about even decades after he first articulated them.
It's remarkable how relevant his work remains in the face of contemporary challenges, like climate change, technological disruption, and political polarization. He provides us with a framework for thinking critically about the role of government, the dangers of central planning, and the potential of spontaneous order to create a more prosperous and free society.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the distinction between true and false individualism to Hayek's critique of socialist planning and his vision for international federalism. But I can't help but wonder what Hayek would make of some of the more recent developments in economic thought and practice, things that he couldn't have anticipated during his lifetime.
That's an excellent point. It's always fascinating to consider how great thinkers of the past might view the challenges and opportunities of the present. For example, how would Hayek view the rise of behavioral economics, a field that challenges some of the assumptions of classical economics about human rationality?
Or what about the growing concerns over income inequality and the role of government in addressing it? Those are debates that are very much at the forefront of economic discussions today.
Absolutely. And what about the impact of technology on the market? The rise of platform monopolies, the gig economy, the increasing automation of jobs? These are all phenomena that Hayek couldn't have foreseen, but his work provides a valuable framework for thinking about them.
I imagine he'd have a lot to say about the potential benefits and risks of these technological advancements, particularly in the context of individual freedom and the role of government in regulating these new spaces.
He certainly would. And while we can only speculate about his specific views, I think his work encourages us to approach these challenges with a focus on preserving individual liberty, fostering competition, and allowing spontaneous order to guide innovation and progress.
It's a reminder that the best way to honor the legacy of a great thinker like Hayek is not to simply parrot his ideas, but to use them as a springboard for our own explorations and discoveries, to apply his principles to the unique challenges of our time.
Well said. Hayek's work is a gift that keeps on giving, offering insights and questions that will continue to resonate for generations to come. His ideas provide a rich intellectual foundation for anyone interested in understanding the complex relationship between individual freedom, economic prosperity, and the role of government in shaping our world.
Now, we've touched on a lot of Hayek's core ideas, but there's one concept we haven't explored yet that I think our listener might find particularly interesting: the Ricardo effect.
Yes.
It gets to the heart of how changes in prices can influence the way businesses invest in capital and make decisions about production methods.
Yes. The Ricardo effect is fascinating and often overlooked. It provides a unique window into how market signals, particularly changes in relative prices, can influence resource allocation and the choices businesses make about their production processes.
Can you break that down for our listener? What exactly is the Ricardo effect, and how does it work in practice? So for our listener who might not be familiar with this concept, can you explain the Ricardo effect in simple terms?
Sure. The Ricardo effect, it's named after the classical economist David Ricardo, and it basically describes how changes in relative prices can influence the way that businesses choose to produce goods.
Okay.
In essence, Hayek drew upon Ricardo's observations. And he argued that when the prices of consumer goods increase relative to wages, businesses have this strong incentive to shift towards production methods that are less reliant on expensive capital equipment and more reliant on labor, even if those methods might seem less efficient in the long run.
So it's like choosing to hire more bakers to knead dough by hand instead of investing in like a high-tech bread-making machine.
Yeah.
Even though the machine might produce bread more efficiently over time, the immediate cost savings of using more labor makes it a more appealing option when the price of bread is high and wages are relatively low.
That's a great analogy. You've captured the essence of the Ricardo effect. It really highlights how those short-term market incentives driven by changes in relative prices can sometimes lead businesses to make decisions that might not be optimal from a long-term productivity standpoint.
It's another example of how dynamic the market truly is, right? Constantly responding to those shifting conditions and incentives. It's not some static system, as some economic models might suggest.
Exactly. And this inherent dynamism was a key reason why Hayek was so skeptical of government attempts to manipulate the economy through things like price controls or wage mandates.
Yeah.
He believed these interventions often distorted the crucial signals that prices convey, leading to unintended consequences and ultimately hindering the market's ability to allocate resources effectively.
It's like trying to steer a ship through a storm by fixating on the compass but ignoring the waves and the wind.
Yeah.
You might think you're heading in the right direction, but you're failing to account for those dynamic forces that are actually shaping your course.
That's a very apt analogy. Hayek believed that the most effective way to navigate those complexities of the market was to trust the price system.
Okay.
Allow it to do what it does best, guide resources to their most valued uses through the decentralized decisions of millions of individuals responding to those constantly changing conditions.
So, After this incredible deep dive into Hayek's ideas,
Yeah.
what's the one big takeaway you hope our listener walks away with? What's that core insight that you think is most relevant for understanding the world today?
Well, I think the most important takeaway from Hayek's work is this idea of intellectual humility when it comes to managing complex systems like the economy.
Hmm.
Hayek reminds us that no single person or group, no matter how well-intentioned or intelligent, possesses all the knowledge needed to make those optimal decisions for everyone.
Yeah, that's a good point.
We need to be wary of hubris,
Right.
to embrace the power of decentralized decision-making,
Yeah.
and to create a framework of rules that allows individual initiative and market forces to flourish.
It's about recognizing the limits of our own knowledge and understanding that we can often achieve far more by creating the conditions for spontaneous order, allowing individuals to pursue their own goals and make their own choices, rather than trying to impose a grand plan from the top down.
Precisely, Hayek's work is really a testament to the power of individual freedom, to the idea that even in a world facing immense challenges, we have the capacity to shape our own destiny through thoughtful reflection, open debate, and a commitment to the principles that allow human ingenuity and creativity to flourish. He encourages us to be skeptical of those who claim to have all the answers and to instead embrace the messy dynamic and ultimately more effective process, allowing solutions to emerge from the bottom up.
Well, on that inspiring note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the ideas of Friedrich Hayek. I hope you found this exploration as thought-provoking as we did. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep those brain cells firing.